There's a hidden irony in the running joke that Dungeoneering is a minigame and not a skill. A conspiracy theory carved into the bottom of the RuneScape iceberg that puts the minigame claim in a weirdly accurate perspective. That Dungeoneering wasn't intended for RuneScape at all, but was salvaged from the remains of a cancelled Jagex game. This isn't a widely known theory. In fact, there's only 2 threads detailing this, and neither of them ever really caught on. I only found out because one of the authors tipped me off. Naturally, as somebody who spends an unhealthy amount of time on RuneScape's history, I was skeptical. Our community comes up with all sorts of theories. People still think astrology is going to be the new skill for the singular reason of Jagex releasing a shooting star quest, so the bar to come up with theories based on hopes and dreams isn't exactly unreachable. I went into the theory expecting to find any obvious mistakes. Dates not lining up or official statements contradicting the claim, but I didn't find any of that. The deeper I climbed into the rabbit hole, the more I became a believer. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was solid evidence. A trail of cryptic statements in official interviews, suspicious trademarks, and a timeline that is too perfect to not raise eyebrows. Maybe the players in 2010 weren't just being difficult when they refused to recognize it as a skill. Maybe they were unconsciously picking up on a pattern close to reality. That Dungeoneering was never meant to be in RuneScape.
Okay, so the new skill, Dungeoneering, came out today, and it's like a mini-game.
It's not a RuneScape skill. It is a mini-game.
It's pretty much just a friggin' mini-game.
People who say Dungeoneering is a mini-game, not a skill, I'd put them in prison for like a year.
For those of you who don't know, Dungeoneering was released almost out of the blue in April 2010. At the time, we knew a new skill was coming, but Jagex kept the details incredibly close to the chest, occasionally throwing out hints that had little to do with the actual theme or gameplay. This is actually where the obsession around sailing was born. A fake screenshot of the high scores led people to think a new pirate quest equaled sailing and started aligning official statements to fit that narrative. But against all odds, with this grumpy list of hints, one player successfully managed to guess that the new skill would be about exploring dungeons. But we'll come back to that. When the skill finally released, it was met with a wave of criticism. Funnily enough, this wasn't really to do with the content being bad. Many people enjoyed it a lot, but they couldn't get over the fact that it was presented as a skill. On a design level, it ticked every box of what defines a minigame. It was locked into one location and played in rounds, where one floor was one game. After completing a floor, you gained rewards in the shape of tokens to spend in a dedicated reward shop. Skills, on the other hand, all followed an overarching rule. Action equals XP. You click a tree, you get XP. Simple. It allowed you to hop on, do an activity for however long you wanted, and get XP equal to that effort. With Dungeoneering, if you spent 20 minutes in a dungeon and then disconnected because your internet sucked in 2010, you got nothing. Dungeoneering is a minigame is a joke that is still going strong 16 years later. That actually says a lot, because the list of widely recognized RuneScape-related running jokes is actually quite prestigious. It didn't really help that developers like ModMark didn't really address the criticism very well, making jokes in fan-side interviews or avoiding a direct explanation to the decision of making it a skill. This debate is what makes the theory of where Dungeoneering came from so compelling. At its release, Dungeoneering felt like a square block Jagex was trying to force into a circular hole, and 2 people spotted that inconsistency, writing up theories that both share the same conclusion, that Dungeoneering was once a standalone project, but follows a path that leads to 2 completely different games. The first trail of breadcrumbs takes us over to Fanorb, Jagex's old Java game portal. One of their most popular titles was Dungeon Assault, a strategic dungeon builder that, according to feedback, lacked any real strategic depth. To fix that, Mod Corps and Vile began designing a sequel in January 2009, officially announcing the existence of a prototype 5 months later. Then the trail goes cold. The game never launches and Jagex never mentions it again. And to wrap it up, Dungeoneering launches 11 months later, the same month Mod Corps leaves Jagex. That's the first theory. On its own, that's just a lot of coincidences. But the timeline of Dungeoneering's actual development adds a little spice to that mix. In an interview with RuneHQ, Mudmark revealed that the skill's design stage began in June 2008, but that they didn't decide on a final iteration of the design before August 2009, just a few months after Dungeon Assault 2 had finalized a design and created a prototype before the game vanished into the void. Without any statement from Jagex, this is all just wishful thinking. Finding or even getting a statement turned out to be impossible. When the theory was sent to me in 2023, I found that ModCorps had rejoined Jagex in 2019 to work on the game launcher, but emailing him gave no results. I tried going through 2 community managers to find him. I even had the CEO look for him, but nothing gave any results. Admittedly, Pips probably just forgot, but still. The previous head of FunOrb, the man in charge of pulling the plug on Dungeon Assault 2, didn't reply to any of my attempts to get in touch. The only answer I had about this was from Mod Days, who did QA on Dungeoneering. He recalled that the skill was always intended for RuneScape, and pointed out that FunOrb and RuneScape didn't even share the same coding language, meaning nothing from either game could just be added into the other. At this point, there's no smoking gun, but there were 2 small, unexplained details that kept me from walking away. The first is a recurring piece of hearsay. An apparent statement from a Jagex employee admitting that Dungeoneering was based on a scrapped FunOrb game. Fat and Wacky mentions it in his theory, backed up by a comment from a reader, in addition to a random forum post from 2011. I couldn't find the source of it, but the other detail backs it up. A question posed to Mudmark from the fansite Tippet just days after Dungeoneering launched, stating that Dungeoneering was meant to be a different game. It doesn't provide a source, and Mark's answer is vague and cryptic, but it doesn't explain what this game was, nor does he really deny it. It leaves a door open. A path we're yet to follow, a claim we're yet to answer. And it leads to the second theory, which argues Dungeoneering was meant to be something much larger than a FunOrb prototype. Instead, it was designed to be its very own MMO. MMOs aren't made overnight, and the first sign of what might have been the predecessor of Dungeoneering appeared in June of 2008. At the time, Jagex's CEO, Jeff Edison, announced that the company was working on RuneScape and 2 additional projects. Nextscape, which eventually became Mechscape and later Stellar Dawn, and a 3rd mysterious game set to release in 2010. The author of this theory, Ren, nicknamed it ThirdScape for easy reference, but its actual name remained a secret. Internally, Jagex only called it by its release year, 2010. We can see this in their recruitment history when they in August 2008 began hiring for an unannounced MMO with a job description containing the code HeyShow 2010, Head of 2010. In December, they hired game designers for what appeared to be 2 separate titles. One description mentioned a new team, while the other was hiring for an expanding development team. Both jobs would have the designers code in Jagex's internal coding language, RuneScript. While it could look like this was intended for Mechscape, both jobs specifically requested experience making games for a younger audience, contradicting Mechscape's target demographic of older gamers. Over at RuneScape, as we get into February of 2009, the management approved the development of a new skill. The timeline is a little contradicting here. The RuneScape history book, released in 2021, claims Dungeoneering took 18 months to develop, suggesting a start in October 2008. But not only is the book already full of mistakes, which I talk about in a different video, but the skill's creator and lead content designer of RuneScape at the time, Mudmark, said in an interview just after Dungeoneering's release that it had actually taken 22 months from start to release. So the start of the design stage was June 2008, with full development beginning in August 2009. This is also backed up by a French translator, Modarco, who in February that year answered a poorly timed question that Jagex wasn't interested in making any new skill at the time. But in March of 2009, all of these different paths meet in the middle. At this point, 9 months had gone without being able to come up with a skilled design. 4 months have gone since Jagex hired game designers for a new MMO. And 3 months into a Dungeon Assault sequel. And that is when Jagex trademarked 2 very specific titles: Never-Ending Dungeon and Infinite Dungeon. We can send Fanorb right out of the ring. Modcorps, the head of Fanorb, was actually asked about the trademarks way back then, answering he had no knowledge about any of them. If they were intended for any Fanorb game, surely the person in charge would be the first to know. The titles also couldn't be for RuneScape because, well, RuneScape kind of already had a name. The only contender left is for their new, unnamed, and upcoming 2010 game. But this time, we don't have to speculate. There is a smoking gun, and it arrived in May of 2009. In an interview with an online gaming magazine, the CEO of Jagex then, Mod MMG, said their 2010 game had been shelved and would instead be implemented into RuneScape as a free-to-play skill. He even doubled down in a Q&A in January 2010, addressing a question that directly was using the player-given name ThirdScape, saying the content is looking great and releasing soon. These quotes were so clear-cut that Ren, who did this research 2 months prior to the skill even being released, accurately guessed it would be dungeon-related. If a full-on admission wasn't enough, the head of RuneScape, Mod Fetsky, would in the same 2021 history book as mentioned earlier, explain that Dungeoneering was at one point considered to become a standalone experience. His explanation gets a little weird. He talks about this deceptive way of playing RuneScape. The same game, but hosted under a different name. Playing Dungeoneering without being aware of this being their flagship title. Could the answer to this mystery be that Dungeoneering was once meant to be a secondary game mode to RuneScape? A version hosted under a different name to lure in a new audience without the bias of a childhood MMO? A project titled, say, Infinite Dungeon or Never-Ending Dungeon.
I don't remember anyone buying Never-Ending Dungeons.
I got on a call with Mod Mark, laying out the timeline, the trademarks, and the theories, ready to hear him confirm that ThirdScape had indeed been recycled into his beloved RuneScape skill.
Right, okay. I can see how you might connect those dots, but that is definitely not the case. I can tell you that Dungeoneering is very much from here. I pitched Dungeoneering to Andrew Gower because Actually, I'll tell you what, I'll start from the beginning.
Mark tells this story of how they noticed a pattern in the average RuneScape player. They would log on, scroll through their bank for a bit, evaluate their stats, looking for something to do, but in the end be overwhelmed by the game's open-ended nature. Without any system to guide them, many players simply ended up doing nothing at all. At the same time, the Slayer skill was consistently crowned the favorite skill in the game. Mark believed this was because Slayer effectively made a decision for the player. You approach a Slayer master and they give you an assignment. He wanted to evolve this concept into something larger. A system where either a player alone or together with friends could click a button and immediately receive a randomly generated adventure. One where you didn't have to think about what gear to bring or how to prepare. You'd start from scratch every time, having to build your way up to reach the end and receive a reward. This idea, inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, was something both Mark and the founders of RuneScape had visualized all the way back in 2004, but just now, in 2009, finally had the technology to realize. The design went through 3 iterations before entering development. From being themed around the Tsar rather than the Fremenix, to being able to start a dungeon from anywhere in the world before eventually settling on a dedicated location.
None of that, absolutely hand on heart, none of that was because there was some technology that another team were using that we thought we could use, or because there was some weird fun-orb game that had got cancelled.
Well, okay, but didn't MMG quite literally say that ThirdScape had turned into a skill for RuneScape?
That's a classic. I would say that's exec speak. That's what that is. it was never going to be unconnected from RuneScape, ever.
This doesn't exactly make this puzzle easier to understand. Mark doesn't recognize any 2010 game, despite the CEO's confession and even throwing Mark under the bus at one point. Then again, there's simply no world where Dungeoneering would be merged with ThirdScape without him noticing. But if ThirdScape was unrelated and had nothing to do with the trademark titles, what about Modfetsky's quote that Dungeoneering was considered to be something different?
We did consider for a while that it could be a standalone experience. It was never not going to be a skill. It was never not going to be that. But we thought for a while, what if this could be another landing spot for new players? Rather than your first experience being landed in Lumbridge or whatever, or Burthorpe, or whatever iteration of Tutorial Island there was at that point in time, what if your tutorial experience all happened within Dungeoneering? There could be another gateway into RuneScape. So rather than RuneScape.com being the only splash page, being the only destination, what if there was another one through Demonheim, through a completely different website? So rather than landing on the surface world and going down to Dungeoneering, you start in Dungeoneering and then you work your way up to the surface world.
This reveals a middle ground of sorts. Dungeoneering wasn't to do with ThirdScape or Dungeon Assault 2. It was a bizarre coincidence of 3 separate teams all working on their own dungeon-themed projects, completely oblivious to each other. It's possible MMG tried saving face when speaking publicly about the project, saying it had been repurposed instead of admitting they had to throw out a project that had cost them a small fortune in hiring redundant staff members. It's a bit of a frustrating conclusion, especially when the evidence lines up so perfectly. But it leaves one important question. What the heck was ThirdScape? And why did Jagex trademark those dungeon-related names? We have all the puzzle pieces spread out before us, but they aren't enough to form a complete image. Without a definitive answer on what the 2010 game was, we're likely never going to close the mystery. The only lead yet to investigate was the hiring of the staff who worked on the game in 2008, meaning somewhere out there, a footnote from 2008 would say somebody had been hired to work on an unannounced MMO. But without any name or even really the knowledge somebody had got the job in the first place, this was finding a needle in a haystack. One person I found was Mod Chili, Old School's associate art director, who worked in an undisclosed MMO in the relevant time period, but turns out that was Mexscape. Mod Stu, who was a developer on Mexscape, doesn't recall any game or trademark, but does remember 3 veteran developers who started working on a remastered RuneScape in 2010. Mod Ash, who also doesn't remember ThirdScape or the trademark titles, does also remember a game being made in 2010 that apparently had one of RuneScape's founders, Ian Gower, working on it. I traced this back to Mod Benny, a content developer on Dungeoneering, who was one of 3 people working with a founder on a new game that started in December 2009. But we're getting sidetracked. This timeline doesn't add up. This is not our ThirdScape. But it is where the road ends. This mystery game and those dungeon trademarks remain a relic of an era that no Jagex employees seem to remember. Even the official wiki doesn't mention it. Actually, let me fix that. And okay, good. Even the wiki only has a minor mention of it. My theory is that Infinite Dungeon and Never-Ending Dungeon were meant to be the new website ModMark was talking about. The names were likely placeholders, trademark to reserve the titles, a decision that must have been made by somebody higher up in command like the CEO, ModMMG, the game founder, Andrew Gower, or the head of RuneScape, Modfetsky. This is supported by Jagex expanding the Never-Ending Dungeon trademark in September 2009, months after ThirdScape's cancellation, but also added a 3rd trademark to their list in January 2010, being Dungeon Master. ThirdScape was likely a vision of a perfect trifecta, a trilogy of games for every demographic, but not an idea that was actually in the works. After all, the CEO at the time hadn't even hired somebody to run the game before 2 months after announcing it. The lifespan of it was likely so short and unimportant that it explains why nobody remembers it. In the end, this appears to be a massive one-in-a-million coincidence of a company-wide dungeon obsession. That said, Mudmark was right. Dungeoneering was a massive hit. Players really liked the game making decisions for them.
Like Dungeoneering, which came second to Slayer in the recent survey of most favourite skill in the game. Now, while I know there's plenty of you that keep telling me it's a minigame and not a skill, you certainly really seem to like it, even years after its launch.
What we're left with is a skill that was, at its most absurd point, considered to become a deceptive game tutorial. In 2026, the skill received its first rework in 16 years. And, of course, people still call it a minigame.
The argument, is it a skill, is it a minigame, was kind of irrelevant, and I certainly made a conscious choice not to engage with that question, because for me, if everyone was enjoying it, then it didn't really matter. It wouldn't have been fair to Dungeoneering to call it a minigame, because it was so much bigger than anything we'd ever made before, and the only thing that even came close to being able to properly represent just how big and awesome it was calling it a skill. I don't regret calling it a skill, and I never will.